What's going on, guys? Joe Munoz here to talk to you today in this video segment about VNAV, particularly how it relates to the approach phase in the 737 NG aircraft. Let's first understand what VNAV even stands for. That's probably a good place to start, right? VNAV is an acronym for vertical navigation. And a couple principles, principal takeaways, if you will, out of the video that you need to be aware of is that anytime you're looking to comply with constraints, whether on a star or in this particular case on the approach segment, VNAV will be the go-to key on the MCP, the go-to button, to comply with constraints that are found inside the legs page of your FMS. Now, VNAV will always look to two places for vertical guidance, one of which is, as mentioned, the legs page of your FMS, and the other portion is going to be your MCP altitude. So if you happen to have your initial approach fix altitude, let's say of 2,000 feet, set in your MCP, VNAV will also look to this altitude along with the vertical planning profile and segments of the legs page to determine whether it's time to go down or not. Let's look more detailed at how this would play out in the approach phase. We're going to use JFK's runway 4 right localizer approach as an example in the video. I'm going to place on the board here, along with also on the screen, the profile view of this approach, just so we get a good understanding of how VNAV is actually going to fly this. Now, on this Kennedy 4 right, we happen to have the waypoints ZTAL as our initial approach fix with a crossing altitude of 2,000 feet. And we also have over here EBI with a crossing restriction of 1,500 feet. We also have the touchdown zone elevation of approximately 14 feet, and the legs page is going to populate this with touchdown zone elevation plus 50 feet as the value next to the runway. Let's take a look at how that would look on your legs page. Your legs page will show ZTAL on the lateral side, which will be your left side, with the altitude constraint on the right, 2,000. EBI will follow just below with the altitude constraint of 1,500. And then we're going to have runway 04 right, likely with a number somewhere in the neighborhood of 64 feet, should be something to the effect of touchdown zone elevation plus 50 feet. Now, I like to always take something like VNAV, which could potentially be a little intangible, if you will, and therefore sometimes hard to comprehend, and make it tangible for you. Now, how we're going to do this is understand VNAV utilizes almost like a straw. It has a path with two ends. So the first end is the bottom. Now this end, the bottom end, is the runway at 64 feet. So VNAV is going to fly us all the way down. This is the exit point, if you will, of this VNAV path. Now, the top end of this straw happens to be the value that we have in the cruise page. Now, it's paramount that if you have not reached your top of climb, that we recruise the box so as to calculate an accurate T over D, or top of descent point, for our VNAV to engage properly and follow the vertical path down to the bottom end, which would be our touchdown zone elevation plus 50 feet. Commonly, when we're working with VNAV approaches, we're going to utilize an acronym LVSA, first of which is LNAV, engage. Next would be VNAV, engage. Finally, we have speed intervention, speed intervene, okay? And then later on we have altitude intervene. Now, speed intervene and altitude intervene will be utilized as needed to comply with various ATC instructions and perhaps other vertical profile deviations that may need assistance by the aid of something like altitude intervene. In its most simplistic breakdown, let's say you've been cleared directly to ZTAL, which happens to be the initial approach fix. The great controller is vectoring you in at an altitude of 2,000 feet, which happens to be spot on with the charted initial approach fix altitude. Now, in the MCP, remember that we mentioned VNAV also looks at the MCP along with the legs page, correct? So the MCP altitude right now, if we're being vectored at 2,000 feet, will reflect 2,000 feet. So we proceed direct to ZTAL, LNAV is engaged as we navigate laterally straight to this point, and approximately 2 nautical miles prior to your initial approach fix, we are going to set in to the MCP, our MDA of 600 feet. Now, the way VNAV is going to play out is once the aircraft, okay, let's kind of clean this up so we can make it real simplistic for you to see this. The aircraft will arrive here at ZTAL, and upon doing so, the legs page will sequence and it will look to the next point. It'll say, okay, well, I've made it to ZTAL at 2,000 feet. Where do I go next? And the next point is going to be EBI at 1,500 feet. Now, the aircraft will now say, before I descend to 1,500 feet, let me check the MCP. Because remember, the MCP takes priority over the legs page. So the MCP will now reflect 600. The aircraft will then determine, well, my current altitude is 2,000. This is what my altimeter reads. The legs page shows that I should now descend to 1,500 feet. The MCP says 600 feet. Both 1,500 and 600 are lower than my actual altitude, so I will descend and I will comply with the higher of the two. Now the higher of the two happens to, of course, be EBI at 1,500. The aircraft will descend, and upon reaching EBI at 1,500 feet, it will repeat the same procedure yet again. And it will say, now I've reached EBI at 1,500 feet, where do I go next on a vertical path? And now the vertical path will say, well, down to touchdown zone elevation plus 50, 62 feet. But before we descend, I've got to check one other place, which happens to be where? The MCP, you guessed it. Now the MCP is going to say 600, and the aircraft will now make logic of, well, both 62 feet and 600 feet are below 1,500 feet. So as a result of this, I will initiate my descent, and I will level off at the higher of the two. Of course, that happens to be 600 feet. Now in a little bit, we're going to talk about resetting of the missed approach altitude, but hopefully as of right now, you have a great understanding of how VNAV logic works to comply with constraints on the way down and respect the higher of the two, whether that be in the legs page or in the MCP. Something else to note here is that VNAV likes to fly something known as a fly-off. In other words, instead of reaching your initial approach fix and immediately descending to later fly a level path segment, which would require engine spool up and of course not the most efficient of paths, what could end up happening is we do something known as a fly-off, where literally the aircraft will fly off of the previous point and then commence a descent so as to maintain a constant descent all the way down. Now this part right here sometimes triggers flight crew to believe that the aircraft is not actually complying with the constraint at EBI, which happens to be 1,500 feet, and may cause you to try to go into vertical speed or level change to start going down and comply with the vertical profile. Just keep in mind that if you have VNAV path in the FMA, the path will indeed be complied with, and the aircraft is simply deferring or delaying slightly the descent to have a constant descent that is far more efficient all the way down to that touchdown zone elevation. Let's now talk about setting the missed approach altitude. The setting of the missed approach altitude will happen inside the final approach fix when the aircraft is at least 300 feet below the missed approach altitude. Now, you heard that right, 300 feet below the missed approach altitude. We're going to overlay the maneuver section of the QRH right here on the screen so you can see where this is illustrated within the manual. And once more, let's make sense of this setting of the missed approach altitude 300 feet below the missed approach altitude. See, let's say your missed approach altitude happens to be 4,000 feet, which happens to be the case here in Kennedy, runway 4 right. 4,000 foot missed approach altitude, 300 feet below that, 3,700 feet. And you also notice the illustration shows inside the final approach fix. So once we're inside this final approach fix on a descending path, we happen to be 300 feet, at least 300 feet below the missed approach altitude. This happens to be the case. Now is when you're going to set the missed approach altitude. And of course, remember, you had 600 set in the MCP. The next thing we're going to do is smoothly roll this MCP altitude up to 4,000 feet. Now, if you're wondering, now that we have 4,000 feet set, where is the aircraft actually going to level off now? Well, remember, when you reach MDA, you should take an action, make the decision to land or to execute the missed approach. Now, if you happen to not do anything, for hypothetical sense, if you're wondering, what if I did nothing, where would the aircraft go? It'll go down to 62 feet. That happens to be the lowest altitude constraint in the legs page. VNAV path will disappear, VNAV alt, and later altitude hold will populate the FMA, and you'll continue there at 62 feet indefinitely. Let's now review the setting of the missed approach altitude on an ILS into 16 center going into Seattle, Tacoma, where we actually happen to have an altitude constraint. Okay, we need to cross at 2,000 feet on the go-around before proceeding upwards to 5,000 feet for the true missed approach altitude. Now, one of the things we need to keep in mind is, remember, as we mentioned earlier, the setting of the missed approach altitude is 300 feet below the missed approach altitude. And in this particular example, well, we have two. We have one at 2,000 first constraint, then we later on have one at 5. And you need to keep in mind your FMA here. Remember, it's a triple column FMA, 3 columns. The far left side happens to be your auto throttle. You then have your roll mode and you have your pitch mode over here. Now, throughout the approach phase utilizing VNAV, you had VNAV path populating your FMA. And upon selection of TOGA, we now have that VNAV mode being disengaged or removed from the FMA. We're now going to go into go around for the auto throttle column, and we're going to go into TOGA mode for our pitch. Now, what this means for you in practical application is that none of these modes will comply with the constraints in the legs page. This is why you need to set in the MCP the lower altitude first, which happens to be 2,000 feet on this particular mist, and then later on, once complied with, we can set 5,000. Now, of course, even if you set 5,000 initially and pushed VNAV on the go-around, you would actually have compliance with the constraints. The main takeaway is this: VNAV will comply with the constraints if VNAV is engaged, but pushing TOGA disengages VNAV, and therefore you no longer have any altitude compliance because you are no longer in the VNAV mode. Now, let's see how this would play out. Remember that, as mentioned, 300 feet below missed approach altitude, the first of which happens to be 2,000 feet here. 300 feet below would set us up at 1,700 feet. And 300 feet, at least 300 feet below the missed approach altitude would be the appropriate time in this 737NG to set your missed approach altitude, of which is going to be 2,000 feet. Once we initiate and execute the go-around, we now have assurance that we're going to meet this first constraint, and we will later on set 5,000 into the MCP. In this video segment, we're going to review the differences as it relates to the 737 Classic model aircraft as opposed to the 737NG, particularly with the resetting of the missed approach altitude. Where exactly do we set it? Now, you're going to notice there's a slight change, a slight variance, if you will, in the maneuver section here superimposed on the screen. As before, we saw 300 feet below missed approach altitude for the NG is where we were setting missed. But now take a look closely and it says 300 feet above MDA is where we're going to set the missed approach altitude. Let's make sense of that, and let's remember back that, of course, MDA stands for your minimum descent altitude, also stands for must do arithmetic as we add our 50 feet to this, and we'll say it's 600 or so feet, which happens to be the case for most non-precision approaches. 600 plus 300, add your 300 feet above this, and we're going to find that the aircraft happens to be somewhere in the neighborhood of 900 feet. Now, at 900 feet, it would be the appropriate moment. This is 300 feet above MDA. In this particular example, 900 happened to be the number. We'll set the missed approach altitude. And one thing you need to be aware of when you do this is that, remember this triple column FMA, you happen to have your VNAV path engaged. We'll keep in mind that now when we set the missed approach altitude only in the classic variant of the 737 in this model, VNAV path will indeed be disengaged, and you will end up with control wheel steering pitch. That's right, CWSP. So for the last 300 feet or so of this approach, you will be flying in CWSP. Completely acceptable. There is a mention of this in your flight crew training manual where it actually allows us to do this. You just need to be mindful of this and understand that control wheel steering, a reversion into CWSP, does not warrant a go-around simply because the system logic is reacting exactly as designed. So remember, in the 737 Classic, the setting of the missed approach altitude will be 300 feet above MDA. As a result of setting 300 feet above MDA, in the 737 Classic variant here, talking 400, your FMA will revert into control wheel steering pitch. You will fly the last 300 feet of this approach segment in control wheel steering pitch. Perfectly acceptable, does not warrant a go around. It's the logic functioning as designed, but you do need to be aware of it.